Valeria trudged through the dimly lit streets, her small figure almost swallowed by the sprawling shadows of the city. The evening air was thick with a chill that seeped through her threadbare clothes, but she barely noticed. Her mind was consumed by a single thought: finding anything to eat. Her mother, Isabel, was lying in a hospital bed, weak and unable to work, and it was up to Valeria to ensure they both survived. She approached strangers with timid desperation, her voice barely a whisper as she pleaded for help. "Please, just a little food. My mother is sick." But her words fell on deaf ears. People hurried past, their eyes sliding over her as if she were invisible. A few glanced at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort before turning away, their lives too full to spare a moment for a child in need. Valeria's legs felt heavy, each step more difficult than the last. The world around her seemed indifferent to her struggle, the vibrant lights of the city mocking her despair. She pressed on, her resolve a fragile thread keeping her upright. But even that thread was fraying. As the night deepened, the streets grew quieter, the sounds of the city fading into a distant hum. Valeria's vision blurred with exhaustion, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. The last of her strength ebbed away, and with a final, stumbling step, she collapsed in front of a grand building, Harmony Restaurant. For a moment she lay still, her small body curled on the cold stone steps. The soft glow from the restaurant's windows bathed her in a warm light, a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped her for so long. Inside, the laughter and clinking of glasses continued, unaware of the child lying just outside. The door creaked open, and Sergio stepped out, his shift at the restaurant having just ended. He was a man of few words, practical and efficient in his work, but his heart was not immune to compassion. He nearly tripped over Valeria's tiny form, and the sight of her stopped him in his tracks. "Hey, little one." Sergio crouched down, his voice gentle yet firm. He touched her shoulder lightly, unsure if she was even conscious. Valeria stirred, opening her eyes just enough to see the blurry figure above her. Fear and hope battled in her chest, but she was too weak to move or speak. "What happened to you?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Sergio's heart tightened at the sight of her pale face, streaked with grime and tears. She was just a child, barely more than a wisp of a girl, and she looked as though she hadn't eaten in days. Without hesitation, Sergio scooped her up, cradling her fragile body against his chest. He could feel how light she was, like a bird with broken wings. "It's okay. I've got you," he murmured, more to reassure himself than her. The warmth of her breath against his neck was faint, but it was there. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. He carried her inside, the warmth of the restaurant wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. The hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes filled the air, but Sergio paid no attention to the patrons. He headed straight for the staff quarters in the back, where the noise faded into a gentle quiet. In the small, cozy room, Sergio laid Valeria on a cot, covering her with a blanket. He moved with a calm efficiency, fetching a bowl of soup and a glass of water. When he returned, she was still shivering, her eyes closed, but her breathing had steadied. "Here," Sergio said softly, lifting the spoon to her lips. "Just a little, okay?" Valeria barely managed to open her mouth, but she sipped the broth slowly, her body too weak to protest. Sergio fed her with patience, each spoonful bringing a bit of color back to her cheeks. As she drifted off to sleep, Sergio watched over her, his thoughts heavy. He didn't know where this girl had come from or what had brought her to this state, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her to face the cold streets again. Not tonight. Once he was sure she was resting peacefully, Sergio stood and quietly left the room. She sleep, safe and warm, away from the cruel world outside. The soft glow gave the room a sense of calm, a stark contrast to the chaos that usually filled. Sergio entered the staff quarters of the Harmony restaurant with quiet steps, the early morning light just beginning to filter through the curtains. He had barely slept, his thoughts, consumed by the frail girl he had found the night before, collapsed and alone on the cold pavement. He approached the small bed where she lay, intending to check on her, perhaps to bring her some breakfast. As he neared the bed, he heard it. A soft, melodic voice, barely more than a whisper, but clear and steady. Sergio stopped in his tracks, listening. The song was unfamiliar, a gentle lullaby that seemed to float in the air like a delicate thread. He moved closer, careful not to disturb her, and peered around the edge of the bed. Valeria was awake, her eyes still closed, singing quietly to herself. The song had an old, haunting quality, something that spoke of times long past. Her voice, though soft, was pure and steady, carrying a depth of emotion that seemed beyond her years. Sergio stood there, captivated, watching as the little girl sang to herself in the half-light. The room was small and modest, with simple furnishings that spoke of the practical nature of the space. But in that moment, it felt almost sacred, as if the world outside had faded away, leaving only the girl and her song. Sergio felt a strange tightness in his chest, a mix of sorrow and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know how long he stood there, listening. The song came to a gentle end, and Valeria opened her eyes, blinking in the soft light. It was then that she noticed Sergio standing nearby. She tensed, her small body stiffening as if bracing for some unknown reaction. Sergio smiled, though he wasn't sure if it reached his eyes. "That was a beautiful song," he said, his voice low, careful not to startle her. Valeria looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "My mum used to sing it to me," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Sergio nodded, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. "You have a gift," he said simply. A voice like that. "It's something special." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and hope. "Do you think so?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Sergio nodded again, more firmly this time. "I do. And I was thinking, maybe, if you'd like, you could sing here. At the restaurant, I mean. We have live music sometimes, and I think the customers would love to hear you." Valeria stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You mean, for money?" Sergio hesitated, then shook his head. "Not exactly, but in exchange for food and a place to stay, you wouldn't have to worry about anything. Just sing, and we'll take care of the rest." She didn't answer right away, her mind clearly working through the offer. Sergio could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear of trusting someone after all she had been through. But there was also something else, a spark of something that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe. "I don't know if I'm good enough," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Sergio crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze head-on. "You are," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "And if you give it a try, I think you'll find that you're even better than you think." Valeria searched his face, as if trying to find a reason not to believe him. But there was something in his eyes, something sincere and unguarded, that made her want to trust him. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Okay," she whispered. Sergio smiled, a real smile this time, and stood up. "Good," he said, keeping his tone light. "We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure. Just sing when you're ready." Valeria nodded again, her expression still uncertain but no longer afraid. As Sergio left the room, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over him. There was something special about this girl, something that went beyond her voice. The evening at Harmony Restaurant was calm, the kind of calm that precedes something unforgettable. The soft hum of conversation blended with the gentle notes of the background music, creating an atmosphere of understated elegance. Patrons sat at their tables, unaware that this night would be unlike any other. Valeria stood backstage, her small hands trembling as she clutched the microphone. The dim lights cast long shadows around her, making her feel even smaller in the grand scheme of things. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She had sung before, but never like this. Never in front of so many strangers who expected so much from her. She took a deep breath, remembering Sergio's encouraging words from earlier that day. "You are better than you think," he had said, his eyes steady, giving her the courage she so desperately needed. She wasn't so sure, but there was no turning back now. She had to do this, not just for herself, but for her mother, who was still in that hospital bed, waiting for her to return. The stage lights came up, a gentle glow that seemed to pull her forward. Valeria stepped onto the small stage, her feet moving on their own, guided by some unseen force. The restaurant fell into a hush, the clinking of silverware and murmurs of conversation fading as all eyes turned to the tiny figure now standing before them. She lifted the microphone to her lips, but her voice caught in her throat. For a moment she froze, panic rising in her chest. The room seemed to close in on her, the weight of expectation pressing down. But then she saw him, Sergio, standing off to the side, giving her a small nod of encouragement. And something inside her shifted. She closed her eyes, shutting out everything except the music in her head, and she began to sing. At first her voice was shaky, the notes quivering as they left her lips. But as she continued, something incredible happened. The fear that had gripped her began to loosen its hold, replaced by a deep, inner strength she didn't know she had. Each note grew stronger, each line more confident. The music flowed through her, filling the room with a sound that was both fragile and powerful, delicate and unbreakable. The patrons, who had initially been curious but distracted, gradually fell silent. Conversations ceased, forks were set down, and all attention focused on the small girl with the enormous voice. The melody wove through the room like a spell, enchanting everyone who heard it. Even the staff, accustomed to the usual din of the restaurant, paused in their duties to listen. In his office, Alejandro sat at his desk, papers spread out before him. But his attention was elsewhere. The moment Valeria had started singing, something inside him had shifted, drawing him out of his thoughts. The voice was familiar, though he couldn't place why. It had a quality to it that stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity piqued, he stood and quietly made his way to the edge of the dining room, staying in the shadows as he watched the scene unfold. The girl on stage was young, far younger than he expected, but her voice was something else. It wasn't just the beauty of it that struck him, but the emotion, the raw, unfiltered emotion that seemed to pour out of her with every note. As he listened, memories began to surface, memories of another time, another voice that had once held his heart captive. Isabel. Her name echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flood of emotions he had long buried. The connection between this child and those memories was undeniable, though he couldn't yet understand why. Valeria's song came to an end, the last note hanging in the air like a delicate thread, before fading into silence. The restaurant erupted in applause, but Valeria barely noticed. She stood there, breathless, her eyes scanning the crowd. As the applause continued, Alejandro remained where he was, lost in thought. There was something about that girl, something that tugged at a part of him he had thought long dead. He needed to know more. Who was she? And why did her voice evoke such a deep, personal connection? He decided then and there that he would find out. There was more to this girl than met the eye, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The days passed in a gentle blur at the Harmony restaurant. Each evening, Alejandro found himself drawn to the corner table, just out of sight from the stage, where he could listen to Valeria's voice without the distraction of the bustling patrons. There was something about the way she sang, an innocent purity laced with a depth of emotion that seemed far beyond her years. It stirred something within him, something he couldn't quite place, but that tugged persistently at the edges of his memory. Night after night, Alejandro made it a point to be present. He arrived early, often staying late, observing Valeria as she transformed from a timid child into a confident performer. The patrons adored her, often stopping by the stage to offer words of praise or slip a few coins into a makeshift tip jar. Valeria would smile shyly, her eyes lighting up with a mix of pride and gratitude. After each performance, Alejandro would linger, waiting for the restaurant to empty out. When the last of the guests had left, he would approach Valeria, offering her a warm smile. At first, their conversations were brief. Simple words of encouragement, questions about her day, and comments on her performance. But as the days turned into weeks, their exchanges grew longer, more meaningful. "Do you enjoy singing here?" Alejandro asked one evening, his voice low as he sat across from her at an empty table. The restaurant was quiet now, the lights dimmed, creating an intimate atmosphere. Valeria nodded, her fingers playing with the edge of her dress. "I do. It makes me feel close to my mother. She used to sing to me all the time when I was little." Alejandro leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Your mother sings." A soft smile touched Valeria's lips. "Yes, she has a beautiful voice. Even when she's tired, she sings for me. She says it's the one thing that always makes her feel better." Alejandro felt a faint stirring in his chest, a name lingering on the tip of his tongue. "What is your mother's name, Valeria?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes bright with affection. "Isabel. Her name is Isabel." The name hit Alejandro like a wave, crashing over him with a force that left him momentarily speechless. Isabel. It couldn't be. But as he looked into Valeria's eyes, he saw a flicker of recognition, a hint of the past that began to resurface. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Isabel, she sounds like a wonderful mother. I'd love to meet her someday." Valeria's face lit up at the suggestion. "She would love to meet you too, Mr. Alejandro. She always told me that singing is like sharing a piece of your soul. I think she would like you." Alejandro managed a smile, though his mind was racing. Could this Isabel be the same woman he had once known, the woman he had loved so deeply and lost so suddenly? The possibility gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. He had to find out. Alejandro sat in his office at Harmony, his thoughts drifting far from the spreadsheets and business plans that usually occupied his mind. The voice he had heard in the restaurant, a voice so pure, so full of emotion, had stirred something deep within him. It wasn't just the beauty of Valeria's singing that had captivated him, it was the uncanny resemblance to another voice, one he hadn't heard in nearly 2 decades. It had been 20 years since Alejandro had last seen Isabel. Back then, he was a young man, full of ambition but with a heart that had not yet been hardened by the rigors of life. He had met Isabel during a business trip to Oaxaca, a small village nestled in the Sierra Madre Mountains. The project was meant to be a brief distraction, a simple investment in rural communities, but it had turned into something much more profound. Isabel had been a local woman, known for her angelic voice that could soothe even the most troubled soul. Alejandro had been drawn to her, not just because of her beauty, but because of the way she seemed to sing from the depths of her soul. Their time together was brief, but intense. They would meet in secret under the starry skies, where Isabel would sing for him, and he would talk about his dreams and ambitions. They had shared stories, hopes, and promises that Alejandro had not kept. "I'll come back for you," he had told her one night, his voice filled with sincerity. "Once this project is done, I'll return, and we'll build a life together." Isabel had smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes, as if she knew that promises made under the stars were often carried away by the winds of reality. "I'll wait for you," she had whispered. But deep down, both of them knew that life had a way of pulling people apart. The project had ended, and Alejandro had been swept back into the fast-paced world of business. The letters he had intended to write were never sent, and the visits he had promised never materialized. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and soon 2 decades had passed without a word between them. Isabel had become a distant memory, a ghost from a past that Alejandro had buried under layers of success and regret. Now, as he sat in his office, the memories came flooding back with a force that nearly took his breath away. Valeria had mentioned her mother's name, Isabel. The name had struck him like a lightning bolt, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. Could it be the same Isabel? Could Valeria be her daughter, his daughter? The thought both thrilled and terrified him. If it was true, it meant that he had abandoned not just Isabel, but also a child who had grown up without a father in circumstances that he could have prevented if only he had kept his promise. Alejandro stood abruptly, unable to sit any longer. The walls of his office felt too confining, the air too thick. He needed to know the truth. He needed to see Isabel, to speak to her, to find out if the child he had been listening to all these nights was the daughter he never knew he had. With a sense of urgency, he grabbed his coat and headed out of the restaurant. The city streets were a blur as he made his way to the hospital where Valeria had said her mother was being treated. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and hope. What would he say to her? How could he possibly explain his absence, his failure to keep his promise? The corridors of the hospital were dimly lit, the sterile smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. The quiet hum of medical machines filled the silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of nurses' feet on the linoleum floors. Alejandro walked slowly, his footsteps echoing down the long hallway as he approached Isabel's room. He hadn't been here in years, yet the place felt all too familiar. Cold, clinical, a place where time seemed to stand still. He paused outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. A part of him wanted to turn back, to leave and pretend that he hadn't come this far. But he couldn't. Not after what he had learned from Valeria. The name had struck him like a bolt of lightning. Isabel. He had to see her, to know if it was truly her. Taking a deep breath, Alejandro pushed the door open. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small lamp by the bed. The figure lying there was frail, a shadow of the woman he remembered, but there was no mistaking her. It was Isabel. His heart clenched at the sight of her, the memories of their time together rushing back with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. Isabel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. It took her a moment to focus, but when she did, her breath caught in her throat. "Alejandro," she whispered, disbelief coloring her tone. Alejandro nodded, stepping further into the room. "It's me," he replied softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and the weight of their shared past. Alejandro sat down in the chair beside the bed, his eyes never leaving her face. Isabel looked at him, her gaze steady but filled with a sadness that cut deep. "You found me," she said finally, her voice weak but laced with something that sounded like both relief and regret. "I didn't know it was you," Alejandro admitted. "Not until Valeria, your daughter, she spoke of you, and I couldn't believe it. I had to see for myself." Isabel smiled faintly, a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's been a long time." "Yes, it has." Alejandro's voice was thick with emotion. "Too long." They lapsed into silence again, the years of separation and unfulfilled promises hanging between them like a ghost. Alejandro struggled to find the right words, but everything he wanted to say felt inadequate. How could he explain why he had left? How could he make her understand the choices he had made? "I never thought I'd see you again," Isabel said quietly, breaking the silence. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, as if the memories were playing out before her. "I thought we were done." Alejandro winced at the words, the pain they carried. "I thought so too," he admitted. "But here we are." Isabel turned her head to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Why now, Alejandro? After all these years?" "I don't know," he confessed. "Maybe it's fate. Maybe it's guilt. Or maybe it's something else. But seeing Valeria, hearing her sing, it reminded me of everything I lost. Everything we lost." Isabel's eyes softened, but there was a lingering sadness there. "We were young," she said, as if trying to console both him and herself. "We made mistakes. But I never blamed you. I want you to know that." Alejandro looked down at his hands, his throat tightening with emotion. "I blamed myself," he said, his voice raw. "For leaving, for not coming back. I should have fought harder." Isabel reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on his. "We can't change the past," she said gently, "but we can choose what to do now." Alejandro looked up, meeting her gaze. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, a resilience that he had always admired. Despite everything, despite the years of separation and the hardships she had faced, she was still the Isabel he had fallen in love with. "I want to help," he said, his voice firm. "You and Valeria. I can't undo what happened, but I can try to make things right." Alejandro's home was a world away from the cold, sterile hospital corridors Valeria had known. The grand entrance hall, with its polished marble floors and sweeping staircase, seemed almost too vast for the small girl who stood at its threshold. She hesitated, taking in the rich wood paneling, the art that adorned the walls, and the soft, warm light that filled the space. It was beautiful, yes, but also intimidating, nothing like the cramped, noisy streets she was used to. Alejandro noticed her hesitation and gave her a reassuring smile. "It's just a house, Valeria," he said gently. "A bit bigger than most, but still just a house." Valeria nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. She followed him as he led the way through the hall and into a spacious living room, where a fire crackled softly in the fireplace. The warmth of the room, both literal and figurative, began to melt away some of her apprehension. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't quite belong in such a place. "Your mother will be comfortable here," Alejandro continued as he gestured toward a large plush sofa. "I've arranged for the best care. She'll have everything she needs." Valeria sat down gingerly on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. The thought of her mother being cared for in such a place was both comforting and overwhelming. It was hard to believe that this was her life now, after everything they had been through. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Alejandro sat down across from her, studying her carefully. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she held herself so tensely, as if she were waiting for the ground to fall out from beneath her. He understood that feeling all too well. He had spent most of his life guarding himself, distancing his emotions behind a wall of work and responsibilities. But now, with Isabel and Valeria back in his life, that wall was beginning to crumble. "You don't have to thank me," Alejandro said, his tone soft but firm. "I'm just trying to make things right." Valeria looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. She found none. There was something in his eyes, something warm, but also cautious, like he was just as afraid of getting hurt as she was. "How's your mother doing?" Alejandro asked, shifting the conversation to something he knew mattered most to her. "She's better," Valeria said, a small smile touching her lips. "The doctors say she's improving, but it's slow." Alejandro nodded, feeling a pang of guilt for not being there sooner. "She's strong, like you," he said. "She'll get through this." Valeria's smile faded slightly, replaced by a shadow of doubt. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice trembling just a little. Alejandro leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We'll make sure of it," he said, his voice steady, reassuring. "You're not alone in this, Valeria. We'll get through it together." She looked at him again, and this time there was something else in her gaze, a glimmer of hope, fragile but growing. She nodded, and for the first time since entering the house, she seemed to relax, if only a little. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Isabel was moved into the house, where she was given a room of her own, with every comfort Alejandro could provide. Valeria continued to perform at Harmony, her voice drawing larger crowds with each passing night. But it was the time spent at home that began to change things. Slowly but surely, Alejandro found himself looking forward to those quiet evenings, sitting in the living room with Valeria, sometimes in conversation, sometimes in comfortable silence. They were both careful, not wanting to push too hard or too fast, but there was a growing bond between them, something neither had expected, but both had come to cherish. One evening, after Valeria had returned from a performance, they sat together by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over the room. Valeria leaned back into the cushions, her eyes half closed, a peaceful expression on her face that Alejandro hadn't seen before. "You did well tonight," Alejandro said, breaking the silence. Valeria opened her eyes and smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Thanks," she replied, her voice content. "It felt good." Alejandro nodded, feeling a sense of pride that surprised him. He had never thought of himself as a father figure, but with Valeria it felt right. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Alejandro glanced over at Valeria, who had drifted off to sleep, her small form curled up on the sofa. He watched her for a moment, a quiet determination settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He would be there for her, for both of them, whatever it took. The Harmony restaurant was alive with a quiet hum of anticipation. Patrons filled the tables, their murmured conversations buzzing with excitement as they awaited the evening's performance. The lights had been dimmed, casting the room in a warm, intimate glow, while the stage stood ready, a single spotlight illuminating the microphone that awaited Valeria's voice. Backstage, Valeria paced nervously, her heart pounding in rhythm with the buzz of the crowd outside. This was her biggest night yet, the night that could change everything. But as she prepared to step out into the spotlight, her thoughts were consumed by something far from the stage. Her mother's health had taken a sudden turn earlier that day. The doctors had been vague, their faces grim as they explained the complications. Isabel, despite her weakened state, had insisted that Valeria perform. "This is your night," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." Valeria hadn't been so sure. The image of her mother, pale and fragile in her hospital bed, was burned into her mind. She had wanted to cancel, to stay by her side, but Isabel wouldn't hear of it. "You've worked too hard for this," she had said. "You need to go." Alejandro had been there too, his presence a steadying force amidst the turmoil. He had promised to stay with Isabel, to watch over her while Valeria performed. "I'll take care of her," he had assured her, his voice calm and confident. "You focus on your music. It's what she wants." And so here she was, standing in the wings, ready to go on stage while the weight of her mother's illness pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The audience was waiting. Her mother was waiting. She had to do this, for her, for them both. A stagehand gave her a nod, signaling it was time. Valeria nodded back, her resolve hardening. She stepped out into the spotlight, the warmth of the lights hitting her as the murmur of the crowd faded into expectant silence. She grasped the microphone, feeling its cool metal against her skin. The room seemed to hold its breath as she stood there, the silence almost deafening. Then, with a deep breath, she began to sing. At first, her voice was quiet, almost tentative, as if she was testing the waters. But as she continued, something shifted within her. The worries, the fears, the weight of her mother's illness, they all seemed to melt away, leaving only the music. Her voice grew stronger, richer, filling the room with a sound that was both haunting and beautiful. The audience was transfixed, their earlier conversations forgotten as they were drawn into the world Valeria created with her voice. She sang with a depth of emotion that belied her years, each note carrying a piece of her heart. It was as if she was singing not just for herself, but for her mother, for Alejandro, for everyone who had supported her on this journey. Backstage, Alejandro watched from the shadows, his eyes never leaving the young girl on stage. He could see the struggle in her, the way she fought to keep her emotions in check, even as she poured them into her performance. He admired her strength, her resilience. It was moments like these that solidified his role in her life, not just as a protector, but as a father figure. As the final note of her song echoed through the room, there was a brief moment of silence, a collective intake of breath, before the applause erupted. It was thunderous, overwhelming, but Valeria barely noticed. She stood there, breathless, her heart pounding for reasons beyond the performance. The crowd rose to their feet, cheering, but Valeria's mind was elsewhere. She needed to get back, to see her mother. She offered a small bow, then hurried off the stage, her heart racing with both the thrill of the performance and the fear that had never truly left her. Alejandro was waiting for her in the wings, his face unreadable. "You did wonderfully," he said, but Valeria barely heard him. "How's my mum?" she asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. Alejandro hesitated for the briefest moment, then smiled. "She's here," he said softly. "She insisted on coming. She didn't want to miss it." Valeria's eyes widened in shock. "She's here?" Alejandro nodded and gestured toward the far corner of the room. There, in a quiet spot near the back, sat Isabel, her face pale but her eyes shining with pride and love. Valeria felt a rush of relief and joy, so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. She ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You came," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Isabel smiled, weak but content. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," she replied, her voice soft but filled with warmth. Alejandro's home had transformed from a house of solitary echoes into a place filled with warmth and comfort. The once imposing walls now felt inviting, with the soft glow of evening light filtering through the windows, casting gentle shadows across the room. The dining table was set for 3, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound in the room as the small family shared a quiet meal together. Valeria, seated between Alejandro and Isabel, glanced around the room, a sense of disbelief still lingering in her mind. The chaos and uncertainty of the past months seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an unfamiliar yet comforting sense of stability. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't worried about where her next meal would come from or whether her mother would receive the care she needed. Here, in this moment, everything felt right. Alejandro looked across the table at Isabel, who caught his gaze and offered a small, knowing smile. Her health had improved since moving into the house, her cheeks regaining a hint of color, and her eyes, once clouded with worry, now sparkled with a quiet joy. It was a look that reassured Alejandro, one that told him they were on the right path. He set down his fork and cleared his throat, drawing Valeria's attention. "There's something I'd like to discuss with both of you," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of what he was about to say. Isabel and Valeria exchanged curious glances, their forks pausing mid-air. Alejandro took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. These past few weeks, they've been challenging, but they've also been some of the most meaningful days of my life. Having you both here, seeing you grow stronger together, it's made me realize something. He paused, searching for the right words. "I want us to be a family," he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "A real family, in every sense of the word." Valeria's eyes widened, and she looked to her mother, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Isabel's expression softened, her eyes filling with emotion as she reached out to place a hand over Alejandro's. "Alejandro," she whispered, her voice tinged with surprise and gratitude. He met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I want to marry you, Isabel, and I want to adopt Valeria as my daughter. I know it's sudden, but I've thought long and hard about this. I've spent so much of my life alone, focused on work, and now I realize that none of it means anything without the people you love." Valeria's heart raced, her mind reeling from the weight of his words. She had never imagined a life like this, one where she was part of a family, where she belonged. Isabel squeezed Alejandro's hand, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Yes," she said softly, her voice firm despite the emotion. "Yes, Alejandro, I want that too." Valeria's gaze darted between them, and then, as the realization set in, a smile broke across her face. A smile that lit up the room, filled with the kind of happiness she had thought was out of reach. "Does this mean you're going to be my dad?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Alejandro smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Yes, if you'll have me," he replied, his tone gentle but sure. Tears welled in Valeria's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. She nodded, unable to speak as the emotion caught in her throat. Instead, she reached out and took Alejandro's hand, holding it tightly, as if afraid this moment might slip away. The 3 of them sat there, hands clasped together, the significance of the moment settling over them like a warm blanket. It was simple but profound, a promise of stability, of love, of a future they could build together. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, Isabel leaned her head on Alejandro's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Valeria curled up beside them, her head resting in Isabel's lap. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a golden light over them as they spoke quietly about the future, about the small wedding they would plan, about the life they would create as a family. For Alejandro, the transformation was complete. The solitary man who had once filled his days with business and empty pursuits had found something far more meaningful: love in its truest form. Isabel, once burdened with the fear of losing everything, now found peace in the knowledge that her daughter was safe, loved, and cherished. And Valeria, the little girl who had known only hardship, finally felt like she belonged. The days began to blur together as the family navigated the unpredictable terrain of life. Isabel's health was a constant concern, her strength ebbing and flowing like the tide. Some mornings she would rise with a spark in her eyes, able to move about the house with a grace that belied her condition. But there were other days, darker days, when the simple act of getting out of bed seemed insurmountable. Alejandro watched her closely, his worry concealed behind a mask of calm determination. He had taken on the role of both caretaker and businessman, his time split between the demands of the Harmony restaurant and the needs of his family. It was a delicate balance, one that left him exhausted by nightfall. But he never complained. There was too much at stake. Valeria, too, felt the weight of their circumstances. Her music career was beginning to blossom. Offers from record labels and performance venues were pouring in, each more enticing than the last. But with every new opportunity came a new worry. Could she leave her mother's side? Was it fair to pursue her dreams when Isabel was so unwell? Yet, with each challenge, the family grew closer. Alejandro was there for every decision, every moment of doubt. He was the steady anchor in their turbulent lives, guiding Valeria through contract negotiations, reassuring her when the pressure felt too much. Isabel, even in her weakest moments, encouraged her daughter to follow her passion. "You're meant for this," she would say, her voice a whisper, but her conviction strong. "Don't let anything hold you back." As the weeks passed, Isabel began to show signs of improvement. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic, and for the first time in months, hope began to take root in their hearts. Valeria, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. Her career was no longer just about her. It was about all of them, about proving that they could triumph over the trials life had thrown at them. The concert hall was a grand sight to behold, its gilded ceilings and plush velvet seats speaking of tradition and prestige. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmured conversations of the audience a low hum that filled the space. Tonight was Valeria's night, the culmination of a journey that had tested the very fabric of her young life. She stood backstage, her heart pounding in rhythm with the fluttering nerves that twisted in her stomach. But alongside the nerves, there was something else, something stronger: determination. The lights dimmed, and the audience quieted, a palpable energy settling over the room as the stage was bathed in a soft, golden glow. Valeria took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she welcomed it. This was what she had worked for, what she had dreamed of. Tonight was not just a performance, it was the moment that would define her future. In the front row, Isabel sat beside Alejandro, her eyes bright with a mix of pride and emotion. Despite her fragile health, she had insisted on being there, on witnessing her daughter's triumph. Alejandro glanced at her, his heart swelling with a deep sense of fulfillment. They had made it. Against all odds, they were here, together, as a family. Valeria stepped onto the stage, the warmth of the lights enveloping her like a protective embrace. She glanced out at the audience, momentarily blinded by the spotlight. But she could just make out the familiar figures of her mother and Alejandro in the front row. Their presence anchored her, giving her the strength to push aside the lingering doubts and focus on what she needed to do. The first notes of the piano filled the hall, delicate and haunting. Valeria closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, drawing her into the performance. When she opened her mouth to sing, her voice emerged strong and clear, each note resonating with a depth of emotion that captivated the audience from the very first line. She sang of hope, of love, of the trials that had shaped her, pouring every ounce of her soul into the performance. As the song progressed, the audience sat in rapt silence, completely entranced by the young girl on stage. Valeria's voice seemed to fill the entire hall, reaching the farthest corners, drawing everyone into her world. She had never sung like this before, not with such power, such clarity. This was her moment, and she seized it with both hands, letting the music carry her higher and higher. In the front row, Isabel's eyes glistened with tears, her hand gripping Alejandro's as she listened to her daughter's voice soar. Alejandro felt his own emotions welling up, pride mingled with a deep sense of gratitude. Valeria was not just performing, she was thriving, shining in a way that he had always known she could. As the final note echoed through the hall, a moment of hushed silence hung in the air, as if the audience collectively held their breath. Then, as one, they erupted into applause, the sound thunderous, overwhelming. Valeria stood there, breathless, her chest heaving with the exertion of the performance, but her heart was light, filled with a joy she had never known. She bowed deeply, her eyes scanning the crowd as the applause continued to wash over her. And then, something unexpected happened. From the side of the stage, a man in a sharp suit approached, his expression one of genuine admiration. He was the director of the prestigious Marston Academy of Music, one of the most esteemed institutions in the country. He waited for the applause to die down before stepping forward, extending a hand to Valeria. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen many performances but had been truly moved by this one. "You have a rare gift, Valeria. I would be honored if you would consider joining our academy. We have a full scholarship waiting for you, if you're interested." Valeria's breath caught in her throat. The Marston Academy. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the music world had. It was a place where talent was nurtured, where careers were made. The opportunity he was offering her was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She glanced out at her mother and Alejandro, her eyes wide with disbelief. Isabel's expression was one of pure, unfiltered joy, while Alejandro nodded, his eyes shining with pride. They had supported her every step of the way, and now they were seeing her take the biggest step yet. "I would be honored," Valeria managed to say, her voice trembling with emotion. The director smiled warmly. Then it settled. "Welcome to Marston, Valeria." The audience, having overheard the exchange, broke into applause once more, the cheers filling the hall with a sense of celebration. Valeria's heart swelled with happiness as she looked out at the sea of faces, knowing that this was just the beginning. The night air cool against their faces as they stepped through the door of Alejandro's home. They are silent, each lost in their thoughts, but the sense of unity between them is stronger than ever. They have faced their trials, and they have triumphed. Now, as they look to the future, they do so with hope and determination, ready for whatever comes next. As Valeria climbs the stairs to her room, she pauses at the top, looking back at Isabel and Alejandro, who stand arm in arm at the bottom. "We did it," she whispers to herself, a smile breaking across her face. "Yes, we did," Alejandro echoes softly, as if he can hear her thoughts. The door closes behind Valeria, and with it, a chapter of their lives comes to an end. But a new beginning awaits, one filled with promise, love, and the unshakable bond of a family united. And there you have it, the beautiful journey of Valeria, where music, family, and kindness came together to create something truly special. If this story resonated with you, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who could use a little reminder of the power of love and compassion. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and soul. We've got plenty more tales coming your way that celebrate the importance of family, the magic of music, and the impact of simple acts of kindness. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment in Valeria's journey? Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, in the end, it's the love we share and the kindness we show that truly makes the music of life. See you in the next video.